I'm going to click the record button and let everyone know you are being recorded. You have a couple of options in your screen. So in the top right, there's an option for speaker view, or alternatively, sorry, you can switch back and forth between speaker view or gallery view. Gallery lets you see everyone. Speaker tends to go to ideally who's speaking, alternatively wherever the noise is most dominant. So related to noise, we generally mute everyone. You can unmute yourself, and we encourage that as you have questions, comments. As we work through the different ways to participate today, you'll see I have a few different options, but one thing that we're working to do at Global SL is create a space where we can dialogue outside of annual meetings or things of that nature. We know so many of the folks doing work around ethical global engagement are often isolated at their organizations, schools, or universities. So please participate, ask questions. We really appreciate that. So the chat, you've probably already seen the chat. Everyone should have the capacity to chat. If you don't see it, you can drag your cursor down over the bottom of the screen, and in the bottom of your Zoom window, a little chat will pop up, and you can send messages to everyone or to individuals. So of course, I just sent one to everyone. As a way of participation and to learn a little bit more about who's on the call, we would like to ask you all to just say a thing or two about who you are and what your organizational role is. So if you could just drop in a line or two, I'm so-and-so and I'm this at such and such school or university or organization, we'd really appreciate it. That'll help us see who's on the call. I'll pause for a second and see what brave person is the first one to do that. There's Noel. Noel's our master of chat in some ways. So please allow those to continue to come in. We'd really like to see who's on the call. And as the conversation goes today, we'd really appreciate questions from everyone. Related, please feel welcome to, thanks Noah, to bring your, to keep your camera on. That seems like a funny thing, but we've had a couple of these webinars, and the opportunity to interact with one another as close to in person as possible seems valuable. Out of three webinars so far, on one of them, almost everyone turned the camera off. They really changed the character of the thing. So unless you have a good compelling reason, in which case we understand, let's keep them on. And we'll be inviting participation throughout. Thanks for sharing who you are and where you're coming from. We really appreciate that. And just a little bit more about logistics. I'll introduce some people here in a second, but Judith Lasker, who I'll say more about in a second, is going to be watching chat for us as far as the facilitator discussion role is concerned. And Noel Havishi is going to be helping us with the dialogue that's spoken. So sometimes chat can become somewhat overwhelming when it's simultaneous with speaking, but it also allows us all a lot of opportunity. So feel free to move forward how you feel is most appropriate. So as I mentioned, I'm editor of Global SL. We work to bring people together online and in person around ethical global partnerships for global learning and cooperative development. We do that, as I mentioned, in person and online. Some of the things we're working with currently, upcoming at Bowling Green State University, May 16th to 18th. There will be a regional Global Service Learning Institute for anyone in that region. The big event every 18 months, the International Service Learning Summit, is coming up October 23rd to 25th this year, hosted by Kansas State University. Hope to see a lot of you there. And of course, as you know, we have regular blog posts, regular resource gathering. If you have anything to share that we haven't already put up there, we would love to. What we try to do is create a resource place that's open access. So please share as is appropriate, and we welcome your guest blog submissions, and things of that nature. And finally, if you're not signed up to email, There's a sign in place for email on the right side of all the Global SL space pages. That only comes about once a month, but it's various kinds of updates about what's happening with the network of organizations and institutions really advancing this ethical global learning and cooperative development conversation. So today, I am very excited to have this group here, really distinguished group of panelists, all of whom are getting one way or another at this question of how do we think about standards? How do we advance standards? I think many people have been disturbed and shocked in various ways by the really rapid increase in rate of international volunteering that isn't necessarily always tied to quality in terms of partnerships and standards. Everyone on the call gets at that in one way or another. I'll go alphabetically here. So Brandon Blash-Cohen is Executive Director of Amazaji Global Service Learning and has been at work with Fair Trade Learning for several years. Some of you know, and of course, to be transparent, I've been heavily involved in that framework as well. Brandon will be representing it today. Genevieve Brown is from the International Volunteer Programs Association, and they have a set of standards that has advanced really over several years, quite a network of organizations behind it, and based in the U.S., and has long been a leading voice in the U.S. for quality in international volunteer programs. On the other side of the Atlantic, Philip Mudge is representing Comhlámh, a Gaelic word that looks a little bit more like Comhlámh or something of that nature. They have some really extensive Irish partnership standards that focus on the Irish volunteer sending sector, but are highly transferable and relevant any place. Really high quality there as well. I missed Gonzalo Duarte before I got to Philip Mudge. Sorry, Gonzalo. Gonzalo is Executive Director of Compañeros and recently completed a thesis looking at scores, or at least dozens, of different frameworks for ethical partnerships, and came up with a framework for reciprocal public benefit. There's a lot of insight to share through that process and through his many, many years of work with Compañeros as an organization that facilitates partnerships, international partnerships. So I did ask the panelists to think a little bit about what they feel is unique about their the kind of ethical standard set they represent, and also what they are hoping for in terms of next steps in the field around ethical partnerships. And we're going to start out here with each of them speaking for about 5 to 7 minutes and then have questions. If you have questions for them as they're speaking, please do enter it in the chat, because Judith will be working to keep track of themes and think of things and gather them together there as well. So Brandon, I think you have the capacity to unmute yourself there. Thanks again for being here today.
Thanks, Eric. I'd like to start by thanking you and Global SL. Holding these webinars are extremely important, and I hope we can do more of them, and I hope they continue to grow. Also want to thank our moderators. I've had the opportunity to work with both of you in the past, great people. And then thanks everyone for coming. I think what we're really kind of talking about is movement building and trying to figure out how to police or regulate a sector that's been unpoliced for a long time. So it takes a lot of people and a lot of voices, and we need this to grow. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Brandon Blash-Cohen. I'm the Executive Director of an organization called Amazaji Global Service Learning. Amazaji is a nonprofit based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We were actually founded in the Brazilian Amazon. The word Amazaji means friendship in Portuguese. And we were initially set up as an organization that was basically a volunteer vacations institution. We were taking wealthy American vacationers to the Amazon to do different service projects. Very much rooted in modernization theory for any of you development theorists out there. By the late 90s, we started to change a little bit. We evolved into what now is considered a global service learning organization, in that we created a curriculum, realized that our work could have a profound impact on student behavior, as well as the potential transfer of resources to the global south. And then our last great evolution was around 2010, and it involves the framework that I'm going to spend a few minutes chatting about. in 2010, we saw two very different trends happening in our programming. On the one hand, we saw and we're getting a lot of phone calls from very large for-profit companies, tour agencies, who were interested in getting their feet wet in global service learning. We saw some challenges with this initially. We saw a bit of commodification of programming. In fact, I just got off the phone here about an hour ago with a large for-profit provider based in the UK who kept on talking about their product, and I wasn't sure what they were talking about. I said, can you clarify that? And they said, oh, talking about the communities that we work with. Those are our products. Not the language I would use, but very much, I think, indicative of how there's been a little bit of a commodification of global service learning. At the same time, we were hearing from our communities and our community partners that while they liked and were very satisfied with the relationships and hosting students, they were very interested in developing professional development opportunities for themselves through these programs. They were looking for more reciprocity, more transparency, and ultimately more voice. And so we saw these two things happening. We saw the commodification, and we were hearing from our communities that they wanted more voice. And so we stepped back and we looked at different models that existed in whenever products and big marketplaces become commodified. And we got really interested in the fair trade model. We got very inspired by what was going on in Jamaica with one of our communities that had a collective of women who had very much dedicated a big part of their lives to try to flip the script on what it meant to be a host community. And so we decided to think through what it would look like if we made a fair trade learning model of international engagement. And that's exactly what we did. Basically, fair trade learning focuses on three main parts. That's transparency, that being capital conscious, making sure that everybody is a part of these programs is getting the fair wage that they deserve, that these are community-driven experiences, that communities, not foreign entities or providers or universities or faculty members, are the ones dictating what's going on the ground. And then finally, credible caring and sustainability. And what I mean by that is we particularly want to make sure that any vulnerable population is not being engaged in any sort of unethical ways. Okay, so what is unique about this framework? I think fair trade learning attempts to address problems associated with the marketplace. It was very hard for us to admit that this is a gigantic marketplace that's outside of the bubble of the people in this conversation. We are but a small speck of the folks who are engaging the world through volunteer programming. So, you know, the sector has been commodified in ways that most participants in these programs, most faculty members, most leaders just don't realize. And so in our experience, unfortunately, it's the demand of the visitor, not the demand of the host, that too often has been driving these programs. And what fair trade learning tries to do is change the marketplace a little bit and give more respect, more value, more input, more power to the host community, but in a sustainable way. And finally, how would we like to see this work advanced? We want to see this taken to the people. Now, this conversation is a great starting point for that. We were very lucky a few years ago to get a shout out on NPR for fair trade learning. There's been great viral websites that have pushed the fair trade learning framework. Of course, if you haven't seen the rubric that has been created, you can check that out on globalsl.org. Eric's work and a lot of other researchers around the world have really put a lot of emphasis in making fair trade learning come alive. But at this point, it's still very much locked in an academic setting. And as Judith Lasker points out in her book about health volunteering, you know, the academic world as it relates to international volunteering is just but a small little area. By my count, Amazaji, for example, represents 0.0003% of the overall multi-billion-dollar sector. So what that means is, the point is, as long as there's money to be made, and there's going to be money to be made, and consumers are unfamiliar with the marketplace, this type of like neo-colonialism and white savior complex that we're all concerned with is going to continue to flourish. So we really, really, really need to figure out ways to get these conversations out of small pockets and get them to people and participants, students and faculty members. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brandon. And before Genevieve starts, and Genevieve, you can unmute yourself as you get ready there, I did want to mention here, I was remiss in neglecting to mention that Judith Lasker, who's helping us with some of the chat facilitation, is joining us in part, well, one, because she's extremely interested in this topic, but she demonstrated that recently through publishing Hoping to Help, which is an excellent book about the global medical international volunteer sector in particular. Judy's a professor of sociology at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania, and Hoping to Help is really an excellent book, particularly in international health volunteering. Also, Noel Habashi will be jumping in to facilitate some of the conversation here and the upcoming transitions. Noel's a doctoral student at Penn State University and particularly focused on community impact, so really bringing fresh eyes to our challenging sector. Okay, Genevieve, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Eric. Yeah, I'm excited to be part of these conversations. I think they're critical to the field of international volunteering and service learning. And I think many of the concerns we all share of what's going on and the rapid growth that we've seen. And a little bit about IVPA. So IVPA stands for International Volunteer Programs Association. We are a US-based standards association specifically for international volunteering. We have been around since the late 90s. We have 35 different best practices that we call our principles and practices that were developed in that time with a consortium of organizations concerned about international volunteering. And once we kind of saw the rapid growth of international volunteering and the need for kind of standards, principles and practices became kind of our guiding post for IVPA, and we transitioned into an accreditation standards organization. We are US-based, so organizations, in order to become a member of IVPA, have to have an office in the US, as well as be incorporated for 2 years. And they have to meet our 35 best practices. We're a small organization on the grand scale of organizations out there. We have 8 current members that are, in good standing with IVPA. And our principles and practices, they cover a lot of the organizational side, though some do touch on some of these important topics about, communication and relationships with the host community. A lot of them deal with safety and, kind of organizational topics. They're divided up into pre-program, program, post-program, and organizational. And so that's kind of what the focus is. But one thing I would really like to see, and I know is a hot kind of the major concern for our members, is looking at the issues around ethics and kind of these themes. So I'm excited to be part of the conversation. What I'd like to see kind of in this field of standards is something that Brandon touched on, is just, I think, more awareness and education for people interested in international volunteering. I think university settings provide a lot of support and maybe opportunity for kind of learning these about the issues and raising questions. But kind of the everyday person kind of just on their computer Googling maybe not be confronted with some of these questions. And so that's one thing I would like to see. Sorry if I wasn't looking at the chat. So, but I think a second thing that I really like to see that I know our members are interested in as well is just the issues around measuring impact in the host communities, and kind of around the quality of the volunteer projects, and what are ways that we can measure that impact and really make sure that these relationships are strong and reciprocal and sustainable projects. And that's a little bit about IVPA. So that's us.
Thank you very much, Genevieve. And just kind of moving down alphabetically here, Gonzalo, do you mind sharing on the same topic here? Gonzalo, are you there?
Sorry about that. Yep, I'm here now.
All right. Good.
Good. Can I share my screen?
Yeah, you can. You can just hit the share screen down at the bottom there.
Okay, fantastic. All right, is that working?
Perfect. That's perfect.
Great. Okay, so Eric was pretty strict about this 7 minutes, so I'm going to be very task-oriented here. Hope you don't mind. So, except I can't move my page to page. Sorry. Is there something in Zoom that allows me to move page to page, Eric? It's just slow. Okay. Okay, sorry. All right, to take off on what Genevieve and Brandon were saying, a little bit about the context, here are links to 9 videos that for the most part have been made by people outside of the academic sector, in some cases former disgruntled volunteerists who have come back to make very funny and incisive criticisms of their experience. In other cases, more sophisticated documentaries. In any event, while there are 2+ million people around the world spending $5+ billion on some type of north-south exchange, and there's a lot of different types, as you know, annually, there's now an increasing number of people who are critical of the endeavor. So I think it's super important, and I was motivated by the fact that that the work I'd been doing for 15 years was becoming devalued and denigrated by practitioners who were not following standards of practice. So the first question we were asked to answer is, what's unique about the standard set that I represent? So here are a couple of answers, and I'm going to show you examples from the standard set in a moment. First of all, it's an integrated framework with intentional terminology. So in my master's research, I looked at 21 existing standards and I did 14 key informant interviews and did a lit review of 145 sources and assembled all that together into 6 common standards. So it brings together a lot of standards that have been disparately located previously. It reflects a theory of change. Theory of change language is increasingly common in international development, and Comhlámh is engaged at the intersection of international development and international education. So I brought in a theory of change matrix with very specific inputs, activities, outputs, and outcomes. And I presented it in a user-friendly way. So by way of example, don't panic because the next couple of slides are very detailed. We're not going to go through the detail, but by way of example for you to refer to later, these are the 6 standards that were found to be in common amongst the existing ones that I found. None of those would be a huge surprise to you, and this is the part where I don't want you to panic. You can look at this on your own time, but each of those standards has been put into a very clear matrix with an objective, a theory of change, an antithetical statement, which is really important. What we don't want is as important as what we do want. And then very specific I hesitate to say criteria because it didn't aim to be prescriptive, but for ease of conversation, let's use criteria that each of the engaged entities could undertake, the sponsor, intermediary, and host organization. What are the different inputs, activities, outcomes, and indicators that each of the parties would undertake in order to reach this standard? That's what this matrix, that's the question that this matrix answers. What would each sponsor, intermediary, and host organization undertake in terms of inputs, activities, outcomes, and indicators in order to reach this standard? And I did that process for each of the 6 standards. And this is something you can go back to on your own time and learn from, critique, improve, and share. And if we wanted later in the conversation to come back to one and sort of explore it as an example, then we could do that. I mentioned that the standards, one of the unique features of the 6 standards of practice that I identified was that I put them into a user-friendly format. And while people were happy to receive the research that had done this assembling work, they were even happier to receive this double-sided, legal-sized infographic. And what this infographic did was take the 6 standards, create a defining rationale for them, and specifically said what to look for and what to avoid. So it was made for anybody could use this. Somebody in a national liaison office on a campus could use this. A young adult coming across this on the internet could use this. A volunteerism organization could use this. Obviously, academics could explore and probe and critique this as well and continue to iterate it. And so by identifying the topic in a sustainable and graphic way, identifying what to look for, what to avoid, we could summarize at the bottom of the page why it matters. Why does this matter? And so this has been a very popular resource for people across about 100 institutions in North America so far, and some further abroad. The second question that I was asked to answer is how would I like to see standards work and understanding further advanced? And so my answer to that is for all of us to continue to develop and use terminology more intentionally, to be transparent about the difference between mutual and reciprocal benefit, which I'll go into in a moment, and to continue to engage and iterate in communities of practice. So I, like others, would like to thank Global SL, Eric, and others for bringing us together. I think this is very, very important, and this forum of webinars and conferences and resource exchange is essential. I also would like to see the knowledge, these communities of practice pop up and be organized more regionally as well. And that might be another part of the conversation later on. Let me just give you some example about terminology. So both in the literature and in common practice, these 3 words are used incorrectly interchangeably. So this, my inspiration for this came out of a business intelligence unit of the Economist magazine in London, and it identifies the criteria by which we would define and differentiate coordination, cooperation, and collaboration. And one of the things my report aimed to do was not to cast judgment, and not to say there's only one way of doing things, or these are the only 6 standards, or these are the only ways you can reach the standards. But I did want to challenge our sector to become more specific and intentional and careful around the terminology. And this simple chart helps us do that. My work really calls people to differentiate between mutual private benefit outcomes and reciprocal public benefit outcomes. And in a nutshell, mutual private benefit is a lot of what our sector does. And I can only tell you this because I've been doing it for 15 years myself. And Compañeros has fallen, I watched over the last 15 years as we continue to execute our community development projects in health, education, housing, and water pretty well. I believe a pretty substantial number of tangible beneficiaries that have co-produced those projects. But what I saw happening for the North American participants was that they were really privatizing, separating, and taking away the benefits for their own convenient use or leverage. And so the benefits for a typical compañeros participant, and perhaps you'd recognize in your own practices as well, tend to be multiplied and expansive, whereas for the person in the host community, we added benefit, but it was fairly limited. So by way of example, I mean, starting right off the top, that northern participant almost exclusively can travel at will locally and internationally, and that's just not a right that their counterparts has. And I think we need to be open and honest about that difference from the get-go. The northern program, by way of another example, will often have a program and a project. So program meaning a series of activities that benefit and enrich the experience for the northern participant, but often the host community will just be limited to the project, the product aspect, using Brandon's language. So these are two examples. There's many more here on this chart that you could access after the presentation or that we could discuss later. Contrast that to reciprocal public benefit. And this is where our energy is now going, is in identifying what are the citizen building, what is global citizenship, what is equity, what is inclusion, what do those look like in our own communities, our own campuses, and what do they look like in another country where we practice that in collaboration or cooperation or coordination with other people. And so this is a much more substantive undertaking, again, detailed here with some examples that you can refer to on your own or later in this conversation. So the reciprocal public benefit is really characterized by citizen building and capacity building, by sharing, and by an integrated design, decision-making, and implementation and evaluation spectrum of activities. It's inconvenient. Let's just be honest. It's an inconvenient process, but it's one that is driven by reciprocal public benefit, not privatized segregated benefits. So the process that I, as the executive director of Compañeros, and my organization has and continues to go through it in an iterative way is to really be honest and transparent about what's mutually privately beneficial and what's reciprocally and publicly beneficial. They don't need to be exclusive. We can do both. And if given the substantive nature and dialogue that's required to design and implement and evaluate reciprocal public benefit programs, if we're not equipped to do that in our intermediary or our host or our sending organizations or our campuses, then should we be doing what we're doing? You're getting into the ethical side of things. And finally, are there organizations around you close by that are somehow already engaged in reciprocal public benefit and with whom we could learn and partner as a way of reaching global goals? So those are some of the advancing questions that I'm certainly working on at the moment. So there you go. I look forward to further conversation with everyone.
Thank you, Gonzalo. And I know a few folks in the chat had mentioned interest in materials, and I'm assuming that's all right. Could we get copies of those slides and we could post it on the website afterwards?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Terrific. Thank you. And then just rounding us out, we've got Philip, if you wouldn't mind sharing as well, and giving your perspectives, and then after that we'll be able to open it up into a little bit more of a discussion and question and answer from a variety of folks.
Okay, thanks very much. First of all, I'm struggling a bit with technology, so I'm on two different screens. I'm in the webinar by tablet, and I'm still trying to look at my computer. So I don't have that much of a giant head. It's just that I can't hold the tablet that far away and also reach it. So I'm Philip. I work with Comhlámh in Ireland. I sent a message there saying how to pronounce it. It's Comhlámh, which is hands together. We're a member-led organisation of returned development workers and volunteers. We were established in 1975, and we have a code of good practice for international volunteering, which is a set of standards which we facilitate with over 40 signatory organisations, which, due to the fortunate position of Ireland being so small, is pretty much the volunteering sector in Ireland. So everyone who is doing volunteering in Ireland is aware of what we're doing and part of what we're doing. The background to the Code of Good Practice is that traditional development workers and volunteers who had been away for upwards of 2 years, who were members of Comhlámh, because Comhlámh is a member-led organisation, became concerned about 10, 15 years ago with the changing dynamic of volunteering and said, things like going away for a couple of weeks, going away for a month, that's not volunteering, that's not development work, that's a load of rubbish. And I suppose one of Comhlámh's great strengths is that rather than throw our toys out of the pram and say, we agree that's rubbish, Comhlámh's way of working is to say, well, what can we do with that? So instead of coming out against new volunteering as a bad thing, as not developmental, what we decided to do was to put structures in place to make sure that volunteering was and continued to be as sustainable as possible, as responsible as possible, as ethical, and as focused on good development principles as it could be. So the Code of Good Practice is a set of 11 principles, and when you become a signatory to the Code of Good Practice, you sign up to those principles. We specifically ask the senior member of the board or the senior member, the CEO, specifically to send us in a written statement saying that they believe in our principles. And once they've done that, then they are part of the program. The principles are, and they're as was discussed there by one of the other contributors, they look at a life cycle of volunteering. So some of the principles relate to before the placement, some during the placement, some after return, and some ongoing throughout the program. So when organizations want to become part of our Code of Good Practice, they make a statement that their volunteer programs are based on realistic aims and objectives and provide volunteer roles that are appropriate and valuable to the host community. I have a cat on my lap who's almost certainly going to be in camera within a couple of minutes. They also say that their organization provides potential volunteers with accurate and independent information about the organization and about the program, that they use equitable, consistent and transparent recruitment and application procedures, that their organization ensures that volunteers participate in appropriate preparation, travel and induction. During the placement, their organization commits to providing sufficient resources to local partners to run sustainable volunteer programs and to take all practical steps to ensure the protection, safety and well-being of volunteers and the communities they work with. After they come back, signatory organizations are required to provide comprehensive and effective debriefing, and throughout the program, they're required to inform program development through monitoring and evaluation, to support volunteers to understand the wider context of development and to encourage continued learning and engagement, to accept the diversity and individuality of volunteers and provide for their varying support needs, and to provide and promote messages and imagery consistent with good practice and clear expressions of organizational aims, ethos, and values. Each of those principles is measured on an annual basis by self-audit through 45 indicators. And the code is up on Comhlámh's website, and I can also send a link if anyone wants it. And each year, every signatory organization must report to Comhlámh, which currently is me, on their attainment under those 45 indicators, their progress in terms of attainment on those 45 indicators in the 12 months previous, and their action plan for where they're going to go next with it. We're inclusive. Once people have signed up to the principles, we include them as part of the process. We do award what we call a core indicators award when an organization can show conclusively that they have the 15 most important ones in place. And we certify again when they've got 85% of all the indicators in place. But more than that, organizations do have to commit to shared learning. We have what we call a peer support meeting twice a year, and every organization has to come, participate, bring things and share. We don't allow people to think of a good idea and then keep it to themselves. We require them to share. So we would have mentor groups and peer learning groups. We have a development education group. We have a code development group. And in exchange for that commitment, the organisations that are signatories, and we are funded through the Irish government, do get external audit before when they join the code, which is a supportive external audit process, an external audit on probably a 3-year cycle or more quickly if we can get it. They have the support from my role, which is almost full time, and they get to be, I suppose, part of an organization which does have national and we would hope global recognition as being something which does hold them accountable and improve their practice. Where we are now is we have almost 50 organizations. I'm still saying over 40, but almost 50 organizations that are signatories. They run from international organizations that people might have heard of, like Voluntary Service Overseas and Volunteer Fund, to what I call bedroom organizations that are run by individual volunteers in their spare time from their bedroom. It tends not to be the tiny organizations that complain about the requirements in terms of self-audit and things like that, but the medium-sized organizations that complain they've only got 3 or 4 staff, not the ones that are running it off one volunteer. We've completely rewritten the code in 2015. That's a process that involved all, as it was 43 at the time, organizations to contribute so that it's their code that I facilitate rather than my code that I impose. We are developing what we call a supporter category for the code, which is for organizations that don't send volunteers but are actively involved in the sector, and we're specifically targeting the university sector and the health sector because they tend not to send volunteers themselves, but they're power brokers in volunteer programs that are sent. And I suppose we're trying very hard to raise the public profile of the code, and I suppose my benchmark from that is what I call the Irish mammy, because when a college-age volunteer says they want to go away overseas, it's normally their mother who says, you know, are you going to be eaten by a lion? Are you going to die of malaria? Are you going to do more harm than good? And so we're trying to outreach to the families of that cohort of volunteers, so that if the mammy asks, are you going to be eaten by a lion? And the student says, no, it's a Comhlámh organisation, mammy's mind should be put at rest and will be supportive of the programme. What makes us unique? The fact that we have got the whole of Ireland on board. We are aware that that's not quite as good as the boasting sounds, because Ireland is very small. Probably getting the whole of Kansas on board would involve more people and more organisations and more money. But it is a national programme which is recognised, throughout both North and South Republic and Northern Ireland as the set of standards. We have commercial, we have not-for-profit, we have education sector and faith-based organisations all on board. We structure it in such a way that it's seen as a resource and not as an imposition. So when I ask someone for their self-audit, they do see that as being a developmental tool that they're using, and not just as something they have to do to keep me happy. It is supported by the Irish government. My role is paid for by Comhlámh with Irish aid funding, and that does mean that we can give more than we ask for back, and that does make us unique. And I suppose, what would we like to see? We would like to see standards, something like the Comhlámh code, but we're not, I suppose, particularly, militant about it being the Comhlámh code, but we would like to see something a bit like the Comhlámh code internationally, so that the American mammy or the Russian mammy or the English mammy or whoever else could ask the same question and be given the same set of reassurances when their son and daughter or themselves were thinking of going away and doing volunteering in the Global South. That's me.
Hey, thank you very much, Philip. Really appreciate the code that you shared. I think we're a little disappointed we didn't see the cat, but the webinar's not done yet. So, and now we've got the opportunity to open this up for more discussion from panelists, but also everybody here on this conversation. There's about 28 of us. I know lots of people have either questions or thoughts to share. I'm going to throw out one question to get us started here, but please feel free to chime in as things are coming up. And from looking at the chat, it seems like sort of one of a common theme of conversation is, okay, it's great that we can jump on board for the codes or the frameworks, but how do we communicate that effectively to students, to people at our organization, to our institution? Wondering what folks have had in terms of thoughts of how do you effectively communicate the value of this, that this isn't just a nice thing that nice people do, that how do we communicate the value to all parties involved in this? Or whoever would like to jump on that.
I'll jump in just real quick. I think as a standards organization, I think one of the critical pieces that we look at First of all, if, how we engage with the public. And, we have a list of questions that potential volunteers can ask organizations. Because I think it goes across the board, right? Volunteers tend to be younger, but, they maybe their first time out of the country, they may just not be as experienced. And so a lot of times they're not thinking not only about these ethical questions and situations that they might be put in, but also concerning safety and other travel issues. And so I think one of the things that we look at is how, giving questions to get them thinking about it. One of the discussions talked about talking to return volunteers. And I think that is a really critical piece, is when you hear from a return volunteer about their experience. I think that really kind of puts things in perspective for a lot of potential volunteers around these issues. And then from an organizational side, for our members, we look at their training. So, in their pre-program training, are they bringing up some of these questions and challenging some of these assumptions? And then even if you do that, sometimes it doesn't get through, right? And so do you have ongoing training in country that can help process some of these issues that come up, or challenge some of these assumptions while you're in country, that can really facilitate the learning in the process?
Just wanted to add a thought as a person who's been attempting to work with fair trade learning. So, and I'll paste in a resource here. That's a fair trade learning rubric. It's a discursive guide, basically, for organizations and institutions that are partnering to attempt to bring them through a number of basically pressure point conversations, questions about whether transparency exists, how it's experienced by all partners, financial, decisions about budgeting, who's making them, how decisions about learning, who's driving them. This idea of discursive sharing to drive, sorry, I'm getting a note that my connection's unstable. Sorry about that. This idea of discursive sharing to drive understanding is something that I heard in Gonzalo's comments as well as Philip's comments, and I think very important as we attempt to negotiate among different knowledge systems, sometimes different cultural frameworks, and often sending organizations are coming from a hegemonic position. Attempting to find methods to be co-creating is important. At the same time, that doesn't necessarily give us tools to make progress on things that we think might be vitally important from a Northern perspective. And there I'm thinking of the important work that you see coming from those who are working particularly in the health sector and the child development sector to discourage pre-professional clinical volunteering and volunteering orphanages. So this dance between co-creation and the idea of principles that might be attempted in universal ways is something that's just coming to my mind, not as an answer, but as a challenge. And so this question was about how to get organizations to take these seriously. Just want to briefly say I've noticed, one, some of the universities we work with haven't been too fazed by the ethics argument, which is the one we advance often. This is the right thing. Some take that up, but it's not winning the day. I've seen it get more attention when it becomes clear that any student who's serious about a public health career, development career, community development career, social work, there's a long list of human services careers that are done a profound disservice when they enter into a colonial framework for international volunteering. So in a sense, these frameworks give us the tools potentially to ensure that the practices are as good as we would hope our graduates become in terms of their actual work with communities. And if we're, air quotes here, teaching them how to do service and development through models that we would never recommend, we're we're clearly not doing our job. That's been something I've seen move some universities. And increasingly in the health sector, the liability question, I'd say in the States, the GASP working group, Global Activities of Students at Pre-Health Levels, which is a coalition of medical professionals, are making it unavoidably clear that institutions should be aware that there's a possibility that their students are involved in dangerous practices, often abroad. And the university is starting to think of themselves as potentially liable. So it's not the ethical reason, right reason necessarily, but it's getting attention in a new way.
Maybe I could jump in and say something about my context. Sticky here. I don't know if I'm the only person on amongst everyone here who's speaking from a high school point of view. Like I'm researching service learning. I coordinate a service learning program at a high school of international school, so not yet university level. And for me, I'm trying to, the research that I'm trying to do at the same time as being service learning coordinator is trying to open up a dialogue with the students to explore what an ethical framework for our service learning experience might look like. I'm in my planning stage at the moment, and I'm trying to identify my students, so that discussion hasn't started yet, but this is very much what I want to do, because I think, before students get to university level, surely there's many of the curricula, certainly I'm working within the International Baccalaureate curriculum, where the goals are international mindedness, intercultural understanding, global citizenship, a lot of that terminology. But I think the critical side of it, the sort of analysing the institution that we're in and the system that we're in, at the same time as getting like leadership, for example, to buy into that. You're critiquing the exact thing that you're in and that you're part of, and that's not an easy thing to do. But it's that's like my mission. That's what I want to try. Before these students go off and do gap years, after they've left university, or before after they've left school, before they go to university, we offer them these so-called service learning experiences on a plate, in a way. We deal with institutions ourselves. We don't work with any third party. And it's very much it's about, they want to go and they want to build a wall. They don't necessarily understand, they don't learn about the country, they don't necessarily reflect on it in that way. So I'm trying to open up that dialogue at a school level. So I think that's just my context, and that criticality, I guess, starts before they reach university, or it should, if possible. I don't know if anyone's got anything to comment on that, or.
Hi, this is Ann Mello. I'm responding to Vicky's comment, which is that I work for the National Association of Episcopal Schools, so we have lots of schools that are in the K-12 or 9-12 sector that do international service, either self-directed by the school, as your school does, Vicky, or working with some of the for-profit or non-for-profit volunteer service organizations. And I'm really interested in these standards coming down into the K-12 sector early. And also, we've been working a couple of schools have really created electives or courses within their curriculum where students really learn theory and practice of service and development, and then the school creates something that puts that in that context. So I think an advantage the K-12 or the 9-12 sector has is that I think that if your school really wants to take this seriously, try to create a space within the curriculum where it really becomes, part of the ongoing curriculum, and then all of the service moves from there. But we work with some folks in Haiti that have sustained partnerships with Haiti, and it took about 5 years to get people to say the first thing you do is you spend 3 years visiting and you don't do a thing. You just visit and build relationship and build partnership. But that was because those schools have created a sustained relationship with one community over a number of years, as opposed to, but then we have other kids who are in schools where, it's spring break, I'm going to go for 2 weeks to Honduras, do a week building a house and do a week zip lining. And it's kind of, you want to bang your head against the ground. So we're in the same boat in the K-12 area.
I think this conversation may relate to something Rebecca's recently brought up in the chat space, and that is, in terms of the different partnership frameworks that we've been talking about, are there guidelines regarding promotion? I know in the case of Fair Trade Learning there are. The way I like to communicate about this is the first educational opportunity that any organization has in respect to their relationship with potential participants is that moment of, I'm not sure that promotion is the word that I'd most like to use, but that first moment of contact. And the image involved, the language involved, ideally is a first educational touch point, as opposed to a crasser form of recruitment. I wonder if others involved in standards have things related to representation in their standard sets. And Rebecca, if you'd like to say anything more about that.
No, I'm just asking questions. Finding this conversation really interesting. I see that IVPA also has standards, and I think that's really interesting. So the great thing about these conversations is that it gives us frameworks that we can bring back to other people to be accountable in our own institutions. So to say things like the medical field is actually ensuring that, or is maybe scaring students now that there are standards of practice in place. That's really useful, but our medical school maybe doesn't know of such things, and that would be helpful for them to understand. And not the medical school necessarily, but pre-med students, for example, they need to know about this as well. It's been really informative.
Yeah, just to answer your question about IVPA standards, I can just read you one that deals with images specifically. It says, does not exploit the misfortunes of communities or vulnerable populations in marketing and program material. Practices this by using images and vocabulary that empower and celebrate local culture. That's IVPA standard on that.
I can chip in here with a couple of things. First of all, I referred in my presentation to my desire to see regional networks, and that was because I suspect each of us is signing in alone or maybe with one or two colleagues from our institution into this literally global webinar. However, I think there's a need for some regional build behind this, the critical approach that we're taking, and to have conversations go a bit wide. So if you're in a campus environment, then not just within one school or faculty, but between multiple schools or faculties. If you could gather, I'm in a city where there are multiple educational institutions, obviously the secondary and post-secondary and community college level, and I'm in the midst of assembling an event for them in May. And so I think there's space for this conversation, not just space, I think there's need for this conversation and momentum to be built through local peer networks / peer pressure, to be frank. Secondly, I can just chip in, I can add, I did look at the IVPA and Comhlámh standards in my research, and I thank both Philip and Jeff predated mine, and so a shout out to both of you for setting the standard with standards. The approach I took with, and I'm just going to try and share my screen again. Just bear with me one moment. That's not working, so I'll go back to words. So we dealt specifically, one of the 6 standards deals specifically with responsible marketing and took a fairly holistic view of that, meaning we looked at words, images, and symbols and how they were used to promote and recruit and engage people at the beginning, and how they were used throughout the process through to the very end. And we called for realistic and respectful and accurate and consensual marketing materials of any type. Going back to the infographic, identified specifically 3 things people could look for and 3 things they could avoid through marketing materials. We've seen some pretty ghastly examples. We could do an entire webinar just on that one topic, I think. And so I'll just add that one of our standards deals with that entire issue as well.
Just to come back to a question that came from the chat there, specifically asked of Comhlámh, what do we do when people don't meet the standards? First of all, we have, I suppose, have a supportive and developmental ethos. So if someone is, particularly if they're a new organization and they're coming along and they're saying, or they're new to the code, we'll support them. And if they won't do a self-audit annually, then they are out, as simple as that. If they do a self-audit and they found massive gaps in what they're doing, I'll go back to them and say, well, how many things are in your action plan to get better? I think that was the history of why we went into the core indicators, the 15, which we consider to be most important, so that we could say to people, get those right and the others will fall into place around them. And there goes the cat. But ultimately, we will say to people, if you aren't meeting these standards, then you are not part of the code. And on average, a couple of organizations a year either leave because they won't meet our standards, or we ask them to leave because they haven't met our standards. I posted up as well there about the DOCUS code of messages and imagery. We do expect our organizations to use that as their benchmark, or to show that their standards are as good as that. That's another organization, which is an umbrella of development organizations based in Ireland, and they've developed that code of imagery. But we also expect that the promotional materials that signatory organizations use are not developed in Ireland and then posted. They're not developed in Ireland and then sent out to the Global South for commentary, but they are developed in collaboration. And you know, I think the slide there around the difference between cooperation and collaboration, it's not good enough for someone in Ireland to say, we've made this this new website, or we've made this new brochure, is it okay? It needs to be, let's make a new brochure or a new website together, and then we can be confident that it's saying exactly what we wanted to say and exactly what you wanted to say. And you know, that's what we expect, is that level of collaboration, not a consultation process after the job is done and the web developer's been paid.
Gonzalo, are you going back to your screen? Let's see. Well, I'm not sure exactly what's happening at the moment, but I see a few questions coming in about just this relationship with brokering, and I don't know, with the market. And Brandon, I don't know if you have anything you'd like to add here. But in terms of the development of fair trade learning, I do have to say, in the beginning, many people who were involved recognized that there was a need to be able to differentiate somehow, so that Philip tells the story of the Irish mammy, and in Ireland, Comhlámh has a name that has some meaning, which is awesome among 3 million people. Is there a term that could foster that kind of meaning in my case, in the U.S. context? Many of you are in Canada as well, but larger populations. Part of the idea of fair trade learning was that it provides a terminology that would point to a number of questions. That there should be, and this is something related to the rationale of fair trade coffee. A lot of people buy fair trade products and don't necessarily understand what that means throughout the entire supply chain, but they have the idea that it means something important. And that's somehow valuable. in the complicated space we're living in. But the reality is it actually never took up in that way. It didn't, it hasn't become a viral term. It's not a viral term. People don't see it out there in the, at least the people who are funding, by which I mean teenage prospective volunteers and their parents. It has taken up a little bit in the university sector. And so there's this conversation around guidelines, but that's very different and a very different mechanism for policing. So then there's this pressure of organizations holding themselves accountable. There's no real stick mechanism anywhere, but also we have not, those of us who have been around and behind fair trade learning have not, maybe Brandon will differ, been successful in getting the language out there in a way that it could really push the marketplace from the funder's perspective.
Yeah, Eric, we've been very unsuccessful. In fact, what I've said a lot recently is that 5 years of work by a lot of academics paled in comparison to 3 weeks of work of 2 college students in Vancouver who published the End Humanitarian Douchery website. I'm curious from Philip, as I hear you talking, I wonder, and I'll open this up to everybody, but if there could be some sort of government-funded, I don't know if USAID or the State Department would be interested in putting a little mustard behind a set of standards, right? Whatever the terminology is, however it looks, I'm inspired by the idea that maybe high schools, to answer the high school question, and other universities and regular organizations, religious organizations, might pay a little bit more attention if there was almost like a government-sponsored set of standards. So Philip, I don't know if you can speak about how that relationship came to be, and if the terminology came first, or the sort of the sort of government involvement came first.
The terminology came first. All Comhlámh ideas are member driven. I think that we were in a space where, and I think Comhlámh is quite good at, I suppose, spotting the zeitgeist, so to speak. And we did tag on to the Irish government talking about volunteering. I think it was off the back of former President Mary Robinson talking about the diaspora and Ireland's influence on the world, and how many Americans claim to be Irish Americans, and we like that kind of thing. And I think we also like the idea that having never been a colonial power, we actually do have something to give that the other European nations don't or can't in the same way. But it started at a member-driven project, which was able to, in terms of it, how would it work elsewhere? I think it would. I think it would for a number of reasons. Starting with that we aren't precious about it. Obviously we would like it if somewhere in the small print of whatever international standard eventually evolved that there'd be a little Comhlámh logo somewhere in the back, but we wouldn't want a big Comhlámh logo on the front necessarily. I think that it does need to be funded properly because in responding to that question, it does need to have some process of eliminating people that won't join, and it needs to be cheap enough at point of use that it's not exclusively for the very expensive, well-funded commercial organizations that do cruise trips to the Dominican Republic, where you can volunteer for an hour and a half doing whatever you want to do, volunteering, and call it, and get your mammy to pay because it's a volunteering trip and not a holiday. One of the things, I suppose, that two of the things that we're doing at the moment, one is I've actually asked a colleague of mine who is based in the UK to dry run through the code as it currently stands and come back to me with did it work? Was it useful? How useful was it? And I think the other part of it is just having quite initial conversations with how much would it need to do to be translated from the way we talk in Ireland into a more universal version of English. But I think that ultimately, because it's principles based and the principles of what we hold on to very tightly, and the indicators are far more fluid, and particularly when the indicators are evidence based, that we ask a question, do you consult properly with local partners before you produce marketing materials? What evidence do you have to show for that? different people in different contexts and different situations can present evidence differently to show that they are meeting that indicator and therefore are demonstrating their commitment to the principle. So we're quite sure that overall the model would work. That doesn't mean that it would work any better than other models, but I think that the key thing there is, for say USAID, it wouldn't be a massive amount of money to get it working. There could be a sliding scale where people that were making lots of money could be charged because they want to be in, and not-for-profit organizations could be supported, in essence, by a tariff on the big commercial organizations. But I think it needs somebody, quite close to the top of the tree to say this is important. And I think Eric talks about risk. We don't want the reputational risk to the whole of the US or the whole of Canada to be damaged. And I think that goes back then to that Irish understanding of where we are in the world. That as having never been a colonial power, Ireland Inc. liked the idea of us doing something which was international but not colonial, and it would need that kind of commitment from somebody with a checkbook to make it work, either in other countries or on a global national scale.
Can I chime in here? I've got a few things to add again to Philip's pioneering work. So the financial model for advancing standards across the board is a little more problematic in Canada and the United States due to mindset around government. That would be fantastic if it could happen, and I've thought about it. Compañeros is a private entity. However, that fact restricts us from applying for government funding right off the bat. And I only mention that because when I looked at the standards, 14 out of the 21 standards are coming out of intermediary organizations. It's not the NGOs or it's not host communities or sending organizations on or off campus that are driving the standards movement. From what I found, it's actually intermediary organizations, and some of which are private, some of which are nonprofit. But I think positioning where the funding would come from and how to access it is technically difficult sometimes. That's one thing. I was inspired by Brandon and Eric's use of fair trade learning when I first read it 3 years ago, and market tested it here amongst our constituency, and they didn't understand it. In the Canadian context, where most education is publicly funded, they thought I was talking about, Compañeros is now going to sell coffee. That's what they associated fair trade learning with in a publicly funded context. And I went on, when I was formulating my research, to deliberately look at different titles we could use it, because I'd been inspired by that term. And I came to standards of practice because that's what professionals use across different sectors, right? We would have professionals in healthcare, in education, in engineering, in architecture, in plumbing, in electricity, in any skill, trade, or profession you can think of. Standards of practice is common terminology. So that's just a word about that experience. And then finally, if I can master multiple screens at once, I would just like to point out, I think I've got the rhythm down here. Do you see a whole slide here called responsible marketing materials? Is that visible? Yes. So here's an example of how instead of creating or implementing standards in an ad hoc way, which is what I saw a lot of organizations doing, and which mine has done for many years, the creation of a comprehensive standard that talks about the inputs, activities, outcomes, and indicators that each of the three parties would assume and be in conversation about is essential for it to have any integrity. It might have a lot of good intentions and some effect, but for it to be integrated and to have maximum effect, the three parties need to be conversing about the standards and in practical terms, thinking about, okay, if I'm the sponsor, I've got to have a code of conduct. I could be riding off the DOCHA's code of conduct. I could become a signatory to that, or I could create my own based with my institution's norms. I've got to have more than, I've got to have not just codes of conduct, but policies for marketing that represent my interest and other people's interests. I've got to have community representation and consent and possibly remuneration forms. It often when we use people for advertising purposes, they're paid, and I'm sure there are a billion children around the world who have not been asked for their consent or remunerated for their images being used. So this is just an example of how the standards and the matrix can be used effectively to create comprehensive change in the sector.
Gonzalo, that brings up a real significant point that maybe people have gone through a lot of thought in just even the development of the standards. But Philip gave the example of don't just say, well, here's a brochure, what do you think about it? But let's make a brochure together. How much of this is sort of the reinforcement of exactly what we're trying to avoid? Of, hey, we're in the north coming up with this set of standards, and this is what we've decided is best for you, and we're gonna send this down south. Are you seeing examples of that where there is that collaboration or that partnership even in the development and the implementation of standards, or other folks in terms of how that collaboration has worked in the standards?
Mm-hmm. Well, the two answers, yes and no. So there are actors outside of this conversation who are starting to implement, or who have already been doing this, but they're not in our circle. And identifying them and bringing them into the circle is a really important step. And so it is being done, reaching those folks and starting to chronicle those examples and uplift them into circles like this, and our regional circles is the next, is a huge advance. That's the next step we need to be doing, because I know it's going on.
Yeah, I think that question again points to some of the very complicated space in which we work. By which I mean, I said this earlier, it connects so well. The work around protection of vulnerable populations and the work around child protection is based on a particular understanding of rights that grows up within a set of traditions that is central to particular versions of development thinking. I agree with those networks. It just strikes me that we're trying to negotiate. Janice has the term in her work, taking on an ontological project when we do this cross-cultural work, trying to understand many ways of being, thinking, and doing, holding on to the integrity of that while holding on to standards around child protection is a challenging space to inhabit. I did want to kind of invite whether there's any additional thoughts or conversation. I liked your question, Rebecca, about impact, which I might be characterizing wrong, but here it is: the standardized evaluation of volunteer abroad programs and of project evaluation. And I wonder if people have ideas about how this might be done. I'm understanding this as a question of how do we know what happens in terms of community outcomes. And of course, participants aren't necessarily the best to ask about that. But there's this challenging question of how would we know about community outcomes in a broad sense. This is a research question that's really important for the field, and then it breaks down into very important individual program evaluation issues as well.
I think if I could just add, it would be interesting to get unbiased information, right? Because so much of what we see in terms of the evaluation is of those who have a vested interest in the evaluations looking good. And so we only see the positive. And if you ask volunteer sending organizations about the material that they're going to post for the public, it's always the positive stuff that they post. So there is a way of getting less biased information through a standardized process, some kind of evaluation, not of the participants themselves, and also of the host partners. I think that would be really useful data.
It's the question of how that I think we're all struggling with. I've heard people make suggestions for and there's some models out there that do things like this, essentially the Yelp version of international volunteer programming, to which I often say Cracker Barrel gets well reviewed on Yelp as well. It's not necessarily connoisseurs who do all the Yelp reviewing or development experts who are involved in international volunteering, trying to understand how to get to something that could approach professional evaluation understanding as a real challenge.
One of the things that I've noticed the Americans do that we don't do in Canada is just collect general data about who's going abroad. You're laughing, so maybe the data is lousy, but at least you're collecting some. We have no information. We have no national information about the number of women that go versus the number of men. It'd be a bit anecdotal. We don't know who's going in terms of diversity, and this is just collecting information from the universities, for example. So if there's bodies that are already collecting some of that data, and I don't know, maybe you can explain why you laughed. There must be some reason why you have concerns about the information that is collected.
No, I actually think it's a very accurate cultural description. It's not always a good thing, but comparatively across the social sciences, we collect data, right? Compared to Europe or Canada. So that's why I laughed, that's all.
I think just to follow on from Eric's comment there around Yelp, and it isn't always cheese connoisseurs that go on Yelp, and it isn't always respected academics or people who know about development that would go on Yelp. I think that's where organizations like Comhlámh do hold on to their credibility. And I think, Eric, you're an organization, and lots of people here that would be those brokers, that would be the people that would stand over and say, we have nothing to gain from saying the good practice, the bad practice is good practice. And I suppose the reason why that works for Comhlámh is that we do, I suppose, wear our heart on our sleeve in terms of where we come from and where we started and things like that enable us to say, if we say something, for people to see it and understand it.
Eric, can I maybe just add something on the question of evaluation, and I suppose it's maybe a too tricky a question or an issue to bring up at the end, but I suppose as somebody who's hosted a lot of students, I get a bit itsy, or I get when we talk about kind of evaluation and measuring stuff, when in reality, service is messy, and it's about relationship building, and it's about trying to understand the other and make sense of one's own identity and stuff. And so I suppose I'm just putting out there, I understand the need for evaluations at a macro programmatic level. But I think your question earlier about the how is really important, and what are we measuring for? What are we evaluating for whom? And I suppose I'm just putting it out because, in the context in which I live and work, it's fragile, it's vulnerable, it's volatile. And I think that, sometimes those things are really hard to evaluate because they change and they're not linear. So I know that we're not necessarily talking about measurements that are strictly linear, but I'm uneasy about some of the discussions around evaluation that we need to have. But I think we need to, I don't know, we need to have other people in the conversation, or we need to think differently about the reasons for it. I don't know, it's just an uneasiness in my taking up these issues. And I understand the need to be careful around communities and vulnerability, but I just sometimes think the language of evaluation moves very easily into the quants and goes into those kinds of statistics, which, and I'm a social scientist, are not particularly helpful for communities. How do we begin to develop a language of evaluation that is really helpful across the board? And I don't know the answer. I think I'm posing the question. So, yeah, that's it.
Right. Thank you, Janice. And I think we're talking about something that is clearly important, and I would love to collaborate with others on moving us forward in a way that takes account of the concerns you're expressing, Janice. And I would suggest that parallels quite neatly in the States. In any case, we collect a lot of data on student satisfaction in the classroom. It doesn't tell us anything about learning. It really demonstrably tells us nothing about learning. And so this sort of satisfaction content we can get from participants might be hard sometimes to align with community outcomes, but it's a puzzle I think we want to take on. There's a puzzle here. So we moved in a particular direction at the end here, but I do want to thank everyone for being here to talk about the ethical frameworks conversation broadly. Really appreciate it. Some who left early had some nice comments. You all will get a follow-up survey, and I'd really appreciate it if you would just take, it's deliberately extremely short, but a moment to fill it out. We're trying to understand how we do support what is a global conversation. Hopefully technology helps us do some of this. And we'll also be putting together the chats and the conversation in a follow-up blog post. Thank you, Noel, already. I want to encourage everybody, where you sign up for this, the announcement for this webinar, there are videos for the Comhlámh standards, as well as Fair Trade Learning. They're each very short. Please take a look if you haven't, and please share them if you think it's fitting. Gonzalo's infographic, as you noticed, is awesome. It's also linked there. And the IVPA standards are there as well. So please take a look. And we, again, really appreciate your time. And as you have ideas for Global SL as a network, always very interested in sharing them and continuing conversations like this. So thanks so much for being here today. Look, I got nervous about not ending on time, but there we are, a couple minutes early.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you
Thanks very much. Great to be with you all.